I had a sort of unusual relationship that was super formative in my career. I went to work for a call center company, and the role was in learning and development. And I met a guy there who he was my boss. He was the VP of HR, and he was super, super formative in most of the later stages of my career. Oddly, the company had financial trouble, and we both got laid off on the same day, which was just the weirdest experience. And we wound up forming a company together. And I've always looked back at my experience with him, which was so different because we were in one context, I was a subordinate to him. And in another context, I was, we weren't of equal experience levels or life experience, but we were in that business, we were peers. And then we went to work for a different organization together. And I became a subordinate in a sort of a separate unit. And I look back at that and I think about his leadership. And the way I characterize it is he made it safe for me to have 9 bad ideas because he knew I was going to get to the one idea that would really change things. And it was never a pushover kind of thing. He never accepted my bad ideas, but I never felt unsafe having those bad ideas. And I wasn't by the way, just to clarify, I wasn't trying to have bad ideas, but it's a fact that in a creative endeavor, right? Not everything that comes out is a good thing.
When was the last time you had to hire someone? And how well did the process of your organization, your business, your company work for you during that experience? Unless you work for a really forward-thinking company or perhaps a huge corporate, which has the time, money, and energy to invest in really nailing that process down so that it works for both the hiring manager and the prospective employees, the chances are it probably wasn't a great experience for you or the people that were applying for the job. In many such situations, that first step of the process is where so many of them fall down, which is where my guest today, Mr. Scott Morris, plans to turn the whole industry on its head and make the best use of technology in solving that issue. So we'll be talking about Scott's experiences from police officer to HR professional to the entrepreneur that he is today, the lessons he learned along the way, what's right and what's wrong with HR and hiring practices. We'll touch on issues like staff engagement, ownership, accountability in the workplace, and of course how technology, particularly AI, can enhance that recruitment process without making the crucial human element obsolete. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. There are so many vital nuggets in there, not just for business owners and entrepreneurs, but for anyone who's in a leadership position or is aspiring to a leadership position. Scott's got some great tips for you there. He's got some great leadership lessons learned too. And there's even some great thoughts in here for those of you who are job hunting, who are coming at this process from the other side, if you like. Now, I say side in inverted commas because, of course, done right, it is not an adversarial process. We'll hear more about that and loads besides. And that's enough from me. Let's get Scott on the show.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Scott, welcome to Leading with Integrity. It's wonderful to have you on the show. Great to meet you as well, and looking forward to this conversation already.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I thank you for the invite.
Well, thanks for accepting. So let's start with, tell us a bit about yourself. What's your career history, your background? What do you do today, and why do you do it?
Good. Yeah, I started really the early part of my career was really different from my current career. My first job, I was a police officer with the City of Los Angeles Police Department in the state of California here in the U.S. And kind of an interesting turn that I went into and spent 25 years in the profession of HR Because one thing that I learned as a police officer was that you can have four people that are standing on four corners of the same intersection, watching the exact same accident happen. And they come away with four very different perspectives about what they've seen and why it happened and those kinds of things. And I think recognizing that is a possibility for humans colored my perception of what we did in human resources, because it's largely the same thing within an organization, right? Your point of view, your perspective means a lot. So as I told you, I have 25 years in HR, and that's across organizations that are as large as 15,000 and down to 250. And about 20 of those years were in a C-level role. And so I've learned to steer kind of the conversation at the most senior levels of an organization. But when you're in a company of 250 people, nobody cares what your title is. Everybody is all hands on board and into their elbows in the actual doing of the work. And I actually think that helped me in my career. When I coach leaders, I always say, if you're here to just be a manager, then that's not, that in and of itself is not a job worth having. You need to get in there, get with your people, really understand the problems, because you only are a good leader if you understand the perspectives of the people that you are asking to follow you. And so I think being in organizations that were smaller and larger gave me a context for what I've done in my career that I'm really happy I have. I care a lot about the concept of employee fit within an organization. And I don't mean, by the way, I always feel like I have to qualify that. I always fit to some people means fit in. And I've never wanted anybody to feel like they've had to fit in. And I don't feel like I fit in almost anywhere. And so that's not what I mean. But most of us who have had the experience, at least, understand the difference between an organization where you just don't have to pick your words, right? It just feels natural, the way you communicate, the way the organization wants you to communicate, the way you receive criticism from your boss doesn't feel personal. Hard work feels like, the job is tough, but it doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, it's the worst day of my life, right? And so those are hallmarks of an organization where you just fit. And I care a lot about that concept. And so when I struck out on my own, and I did that largely because I was in an organization where I didn't fit. And it became really obvious that I didn't fit. And I left really quickly. And I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go work on this problem. And so I founded a company called PropulsionAI. And we are kind of building the foundational piece to that employee fit equation right now. So we produce a platform that effectively interviews a manager about a role that they want to put into their organization, whether it's a role that they're hiring from the outside or one that they're redesigning. And in the course of that interview, the principal value is delivered, which is the manager gets their head around the role. And during that interview, because the platform is digital, I say she because we have a digital guide named Athena. And she is simultaneously, in the course of this interview, writing a performance-based job description, an SEO-optimized ad to go on the web, social media content, interviewer guides. She does salary analysis to make sure that there is parity with the market, given the responsibilities and the skills that you're building into this job. So that's our foray into it. I know, we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about. We can talk about that more if you want, but that's where I'm at. I founded the company last year. We brought forth a beta in September of this year, and we released a finalized product, a commercially ready product in November. So,
wow. Okay. So there's loads of that story already that I want to pick into. First thing I want to just out of curiosity, so where did the name for the company come from, PropulsionAI? Because that makes you think of an engine or something, doesn't it?
And that's exactly the image that we wanted people to have in their heads, is that,
perfect.
There are so many times where if you get the small pieces up front right, you launch yourself to much greater success. And I think too often we don't pay attention to those small pieces. And so we create struggles for ourselves down the road. But the intent was, this platform propels you to a greater level of success because if you get like, it seems silly. It's a job description, right? And we've come to sort of be conditioned that job descriptions don't mean anything. But the reality is they're hugely meaningful. And so is the clarity that comes with really understanding that role. And that clarity unlocks hiring. It unlocks a streamlined interview process, but it also unlocks really good learning and development paths. And it unlocks really good performance management because it sets an objective standard that you can measure against.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the job description piece of that is, I mean, from the other side of the table, from the applicant, I think it's probably the part of the process where it goes wrong earliest, isn't it? Because there's so many time poor managers out there who will naturally do the thing. Like, nobody really wants to write one. Nobody really enjoys doing it, I don't think. And so what do? You get the last one or the last two or three, and you just change 2 or 3 sentences,
Right.
and then you put it down and you think that'll be fine. But actually, it won't, unless you're looking for the exact same person.
But you know what, David? You know what that also does is that it shows forth the amount of time that you're spending thinking about that role. As a recruiter, and I've been a recruiter, I've been a frontline recruiter, and if I were to put a candidate in front of you and you've really thought through the role and you're really clear about not the tasks that you want, because tasks aren't engaging, but the outcomes. What is it that you are going to ask me to be an owner of? That's an engaging proposition, right? And if you've really thought through that, and if you've really thought through how you're going to measure success, and if you've really thought through the competencies and skills that a candidate would need, that shows. So when I come in as a recruiter and I put a top talent in front of you, this person has options, and they are able to determine really, really quickly whether you've thought through and done the hard work. And if you haven't, what I've found is talent walks, and they will come up with like every excuse possible to get out of it graciously, but effectively they're going to tell you no. And a lot of the time the reason is you haven't done the hard work. It's obvious you haven't done the hard work. Why would I want to come to work for you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an early red flag, isn't it?
That's right. And that's why we say, like, the job description is a piece of paper, but the process that delivers the thinking, the clarity that the manager gains by using the platform, that's the real value to the end user manager. And like I said, whether you're redesigning something internally, which is just as important of a use case, I think, as whether you're hiring from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's sort of, I don't want to say it helps you internally justify the hire, but it helps you identify what the need is and where the gaps are. Because if you make yourself go through that process first of, okay, what actually do we need doing? And then form the job around that instead of,
Here's a mental shift that I think a lot of people need to make. Salary is an investment. And as the investor, you deserve to be able to ask for a return. And so when you're, if what you're asking for is like, come in and do these tasks, like, I know we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about, but I'll give you a very quick example, right? Let's say I'm creating a role for an accountant. It would be totally logical for me to say, as one of the duties, follow up on delinquent accounts. But who really cares? Is that what you want? Do you want me to come in every day? And do you just need to see as a leader that I'm making calls and that I'm making, sending out emails? And my answer to that is no, you don't care about that effort. What you really care about is, do I move the numbers? And in the case of following up on delinquent accounts, it's to move a measure called days outstanding, which is a measure of efficiency in accounting, right? And so you don't care how I do it. What you want is for that number to go down. So why are we not saying to that person, your job is not to come in and do boring work following up on accounts. You own days outstanding. That's saying this is something I am giving you charge over in the business. That mental model is such an important leadership, ideal, I think, that be able to, to think about, why do I even have this person here? Why am I investing in this? And the answer is because it creates an outcome that is necessary and important to the business. And that drives engagement. And we know from a study that Towers Watson did that fully engaged employees tend to produce 16% more than we pay them. And disengaged employees tend to produce 60% of what we pay them. So if I'm fully disengaged, you're losing 40% of my effort. You're paying me and I'm not producing. That's 40 people out of 100. If you have 100 people disengaged, it's like having 40 rather than, or 60 rather than 100. You're losing the effort of 40 people.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many studies on engagement on there, and the perils of losing that as well.
And the sad fact remains from the work that Gallup does that only about 30% of the global population is engaged.
Yeah, and our two home countries are usually top of the bad list on that one. I think we were like last one I read, it was less than 20% engaged, wasn't it?
Oof.
And I think the US was maybe like 21. You weren't a lot better, but yeah, enough that it drew my attention.
Yeah. And it shows up in productivity. It shows up in
absolutely.
mental health. It shows up in physical health. There are a lot of downsides.
Indeed. Yeah. And so, I mean, you talked about, you used the word ownership. And I think that's a really key aspect with this engagement piece, isn't it? And that the other word that gets thrown around a lot in leadership circles is empowerment, so empowering your staff. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that as a word. I don't like to think about it in terms of power dynamics because I feel like that's quite an old-fashioned approach to leadership. But I also can't think of a better word. So,
well, but this is, I think, another jump mentally, or another mental model that leaders really need to adopt. I cannot empower you. Correct that. I can't hold you accountable. I can't empower you. I can't hold you accountable. That's a phrase that sometimes gets attached to empowerment that I have this negative reaction to, right? You have to accept accountability. And the way that you accept accountability is when I say to you, look, here's a level playing field. Here's what I want you to become the owner of. Here's how I'm going to measure your success and how you and I both are going to know that you're being successful. And here's how I'm going to help you learn and grow. LinkedIn did a study that said 94% of employees would stay longer with an organization if they felt that their boss was interested in their growth and development.
Yeah, which isn't surprising either, is it? Whatever the word we use, I mean, ownership is one, accountability, I think that's a bit more back and forth, isn't it? As opposed to just letting you sort of fire and forget, as it were. Empowerment, what I think we're really talking about it in terms of like the recent modern context, the post-COVID and in the fallout from things like the Great Resignation and so on. I think what we're really talking about is autonomy in our jobs. So that ability to control our own fate to an extent, within boundaries that are set as part of what your job actually is. So back to that job description again.
I think if people in the audience haven't read it, Daniel Pink wrote a great book called Drive. And in it, he mentions three things that are super critical for us to be building as leaders. That's mastery, autonomy, and purpose. And, that's again why we think it's so incredibly important for leaders to truly think through these roles. Because if you don't understand the outcomes and if you don't understand the success measures, it's really hard for you to offer autonomy to an individual that is working. I say with you, I just can't say working for you because it's just, I can't, that framework doesn't work for me. Right. But, and if you want to have purpose, nobody is going to come in every day and feel a sense of purpose over, tasks, but they certainly will develop a sense of purpose if we help them around meaningful outcomes.
Yeah. And sometimes that can be relatively simple in terms of, yes, there are tasks and yes, they do need to be done, but what's the context for them? And again, I think this is something that a lot of managers, even people who call themselves leaders, sometimes miss the point on this one. And that sort of old-fashioned leadership approach, the sort of the top-down, the autocratic, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, just do as I say. They don't think about going beyond. Because, yes, if we're going to be really like technical and matter of fact about it, yeah, at the end of the day, they've signed a contract, they've agreed to do these tasks. If they don't do them, you won't pay them. And that's that, isn't it? But I think what we're missing if we take that approach is Yeah, but if you give them the context of it, if you explain how these tasks fit into the whole, what their specific role is as part of that, what their contribution is, what the difference they are making to your organization looks like, people will get on board with it. That's where you get this staff engagement from that we're talking about. That's where you get that 16% discretionary effort over the top of their minimum required. And it also is where things like creativity and innovation really start to thrive, and suddenly they're finding better, faster ways of doing things that you never would have thought of if you hadn't taken that extra step.
Well, David, I mean, when we talk about like a sense of purpose and a sense of ownership, right? The ideal situation, you want to be able to say to me as your direct report, Scott, you're going to be the owner of this outcome. And what you want is for me to come back to you and say, look, I know, like if I own days outstanding, if I'm the accountant in my previous example, and, I know I need to make calls. I know I need to send emails. But I may need to do some other things to bring that number down. And the situation you want is for me to come back and say, hey, David, listen, if you really want me to move the number on days outstanding, shouldn't I be doing these things? And you want to say, oh my God, like, of course, yes. I hadn't even thought about that. Yes, do that. And that's, I think, when I hear you say a second ago about the innovation, we want people to innovate. We want them to innovate around tasks. What's not negotiable are the outcomes. But we want people to feel a sense of like, do what you need to do to get this outcome that's important to the business. And the only way to do that is to give them ownership over that outcome and to help them understand how we're going to measure whether they're moving closer to it or farther away.
Absolutely.
Or staying still, which is just as bad.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And I think, sometimes even the outcomes, there's possibilities for innovations there. I think, especially in sort of startup, very high tech sort of environments, there's, sometimes the outcome needs to change, doesn't it? Because you learn something from the process.
Well, and that's the classic pivot.
Yeah.
Which I don't think I've mastered anything in the startup world, but I am getting better at pivoting. That is for sure.
I'm not sure anyone really masters everything in the startup world, to be honest. But
you want to feel on a daily basis like you don't know what you're doing, get into a startup. My God.
Yeah. I mean, the other way to look at it is there's a daily opportunity to learn something.
That's true.
That was my experience. Yeah, no, it's good. And so going back again to one of the other words that you mentioned right at the beginning there, which I think is really interesting in this context as well, is this idea of fit. So I think, anyone who's ever been through a job interview, certainly in the last 10 to 20 years, and they've not got the job, they've probably heard that word mentioned, maybe even thrown in their face, but certainly as a justification, the sort of the hand wringing, we agree you on paper, you're really well qualified. We loved you in the interview. We're concerned about fit. And it's just, it feels like that sort of, I don't know, it's like the breaking up language, isn't it? It's not you, it's me.
Yeah.
If it is a platitude, if you like. So I have to say, I really loved the way you actually described what fit means, because again, so many times we put that down to like a personality thing, to fitting in, you've got to be the same as everyone else. Actually, if you think about fit in literal terms, it's a really straining metaphor here, but if you think about like a jigsaw puzzle, no two pieces are the same, and yet the whole puzzle fits together perfectly, doesn't it?
And you know what, I would build on that, David, because our theory is it's a real phenomenon, right? Not everybody fits every context, but everybody fits somewhere. There is a context where you are not going to have to struggle. It's not going to feel like work to go to work. But there are information asymmetry barriers that get in our way. I like this job because it's close to where I live, because the money is exactly what I want the money to be, because the title is what I want. But money and title and location are not going to keep you in a role. And you know what's really sad? Forbes followed 20,000 new employees. And you know what happened? 46% of them failed in their first 18 months. And I think there's, a causal factor of that is that prospective employees, candidates, have very little ability to truly interview and understand the organization. The cards are totally stacked in favor of the company. And employers do a shockingly bad job of thinking about all of the things that are going to truly allow the individual to thrive. And they allow bias to creep into the equation. And I think largely we over-index on things like years of experience and resume credentials. And we know, I think Higher Rate was the one that did the study that, suggested that 74% of employers have caught candidates in lies on their resume. And there's not a lot of really clear findings on this, but it's a large number of embellishments that are on, written documents. And I think we entirely over-index on the resume, which is a problem that ultimately we intend to address on our roadmap as we build additional products to support the one that we just launched.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to place blame. I feel like there's a reciprocal cause to that problem, isn't there? I think, the higher the standards are set, often unrealistically. So like the classic one that it does the rounds on LinkedIn at least 3 or 4 times a year, where it's in the technical, so the software developer kind of field, where people put out these job descriptions for an entry-level position, must have at least 5 years experience in this specific type of coding or something.
Right.
And the really good one, I think it was last year that came out, the guy who'd written that particular type of coding had seen it and he was like, well, I only wrote it 1 year ago. It didn't exist before that. So how can anyone have 5 years of experience in it? And it's that kind of silliness, which I think it doesn't help the problem because people feel like they have to embellish or they won't even get a foot in the door. They won't even get the interview.
I would point out one thing, and I hear your point, and I think I largely agree with you. I think there's a difference between having a high standard and having an unreasonable standard. And I think that's part of what you're pointing out, and I agree.
Yeah.
And as our platform grows, one of the things that will improve, and Athena does a little bit of this in our platform right now, but challenging that logic. Why do you need 10 years of experience for this particular role, given the outcomes that you have defined?
Yeah. Another point that a couple of previous guests with similar HR backgrounds have made as well is the years of experience thing. It feels like it's a pretty straightforward equation, but actually in a lot of cases, it's really not. 15 years of experience might just mean you spent 1 year learning at the beginning and then you've repeated the same year 14 times.
100%.
It doesn't equate to 15 years of improvement necessarily.
Right.
So yeah, I very much agree with you there as well. I think that is a bit of a red herring.
And that's why we thought, when I entered into this, the thought process behind how you define the role is broken. The thought process around how you select people for the role is equally broken. In fact, probably more so.
Yeah. I think, well, I think that's one of those things where it varies by industry, doesn't it? And certainly level of seniority. But yeah, I mean, the process of deciding. How do you feel about interviewing, like the way it's normally done? That's a loaded question.
Well, I mean, the way it's I resist statements about how it's normally done because I think there's such a variety. Just like if I say job description, people there's a variety of, perceptions. If I say the word boss, there's a variety of perceptions, right? So I don't think there's one way of doing it. I think there are more effective ways of doing it and less effective ways. And the less effective ways tend to be the ones that are less thoughtful and deliberate about what they're doing. I think a really great interview process happens when the leader of that process says, okay, group of interviewers, we're going to split you up. Group one, you're going to focus on how the individual's past experiences relate to the future outcomes that we need them to generate. Group two, you're going to be thinking about skills and technical knowledge. Group three, you're going to think about behaviors and competencies. Maybe group four is you're going to think about the individual's leadership and how they've applied that leadership and the results that they've gotten with that leadership. Because it's not like I hate on job descriptions, manage a team of 3. Who cares, right? It's what you've done with that. So, but I think that sort of multifaceted look at a candidate where if you do it honestly, you're on the same side of the table with the candidate, right? It's not an adversarial thing, but you're genuinely trying to both reveal the company honestly, and inquire honestly from multiple perspectives. I think those are the best processes. And sadly, I have not seen, other than the ones that my teams have built, I haven't seen a ton of those. But they are out there. That's, I'm certainly, groups that I've been associated with are not the only ones doing it.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm probably biased by experiences, but I always find just the whole concept of interviewing. And apologies to any listeners or viewers who've heard me complain about this before. Yes, I know it's one of my pet peeves, but I don't think you get the best out of anyone in that room on either side of the table in that situation. Because,
Tell me why.
Well, I think from the candidate's point of view, especially in earlier career stages, it's probably one of the most nerve-wracking things you'll ever do. So you're not going to be at your best right from the moment you walk in the door. Probably. I mean, there's a few people out there, I'm sure, who thrive in that situation, but I think most people, it'll be nerve-wracking. They may not even know what to expect. They'll be stressed out, and you're not going to get the best answers from them in an interview context, in my opinion.
Unless you're actively working to defeat that. And I think that's like leadership, and you know it just as well as I do. Leadership is about moving systems. And I think if you enter into that process, if the leader of that interview process is thinking about, I'm going to divert and do a tangential example. Look at our conversation right now. Is this an interview? I don't know. It feels like a conversation to me. Why are we not interviewing for jobs in that same style? Because what you and I are trying to do is just honestly listen to each other's points of view about certain topical areas. I don't think the interview is really any different. It shouldn't be. It should be a conversation.
I agree. No, it should be. And I think the best ones are. But I also think it's very difficult to do that successfully, because whatever the best intentions are, almost whatever you say as the interviewer, they're still going to be very conscious. My future's on the line. I've applied for a job. I'm in for an interview. I know what this situation is. And there's little things you can do in the room. So I always used to try and open with a joke and try and gauge their sense of humor and try and put them at ease a little bit. There's always a really bad joke as well, obviously, because that's part of my test. Like, if we're going to work together, you need to get used to bad jokes. It didn't always work. Sometimes it did. So I mean, what other things have you found that really work to kind of put people at ease in that situation and try and make the best of that? I won't say bad situation, but that environment, that context.
I mean, again, I hate to be sort of one track record on this, if that's even a thing
okay.
anymore. It's not in downloadable music, I guess. God, it just showed my age. But if you come in, if you're on a thoughtful exploration, that thoughtful exploration starts with, I understand what I'm looking for, and in more specific terms, right? And if you come in and you're asking open-ended questions, you are more likely to get, a greater level of comfort, because you're giving people the opportunity to fill in those blanks rather than feeling like they're being interrogated. I think techniques like behavior-based interviewing that I've taught for a number of years is incredibly successful. In fact, some studies, and they're limited, but they have shown that behavior-based interviewing is about 54% predictive of future good performance. Now, that sounds like a very low number, right? Just about around half. But traditional interview methods are only about 10% predictive.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does it compare to the traditional method? Yeah, I bet it's a lot better.
5x what the traditional style is. But I mean, I think that's how you get comfort is you just have, again, mental model matters. And in my opinion, it matters for everything in leadership. How you go into it. And I go back to that, point of view matters that I discovered as a perspective matters, right? So if you fix that perspective from the very beginning as a leader, that's where you're going to start down a path that potentially gets you a different and better result than a different mental model. And so if your perception as a leader is, look, let's even shift it back to what we're talking about. If your perception as an interviewer is, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to discover things. Your actions follow in behind that mental model. I'm here to have a conversation with you. I'm going to learn a couple of things about you. They need to be related to the task at hand, which is, we have these outcomes that we need somebody to become the owner of. But that mental model matters rather than the mental model of, I'm here to trip you up. I'm here to test you. I'm here to make you feel like I'm in a power position. So I think the first thing that any good leader has to do is pay attention to how they are thinking about the situation, because that's going to color their actions, and those actions are going to color their results.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I'll admit as well, when I was the interviewer, I didn't do a lot of it, certainly nowhere near as much as you have in your career, I'm sure. But I was very conscious that I didn't know what I was doing in that room either. And so my nervousness was probably filtering through, and I'm sure they were picking up on it as well. I think I got better at it, and then I abruptly stopped doing it. So.
But, you raise a point. We're all human beings, and we're all subject to the same things. And you made the point a second ago about the candidate being really nervous. And I think it's true that a lot of interviewers are very nervous. They find themselves in a very kind of awkward and different position from what their normal day is.
And I think it's quite rare as well that businesses actually teach hiring managers how to hire, how to interview, how to find the best candidates. I'm sure the massive corporations probably do it constantly.
So David, here's another reason that we think our platform is important, is it frees recruiters. And those recruiters, if I've got a team of recruiters, you know what I want them doing? I want them working with those managers. I don't want them doing administrative work. I don't want them writing documents. I don't want them to have to do all of the time-consuming things. I want them to do the human things, the relationship-building things that you are talking about that are necessary, because every manager doesn't know how to interview, and somebody's got to guide them and lead them. And I think the right person to do that is the recruiter.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because that's their specialism, isn't it? That's part I would assume that's part of what you're paying the recruiter for, is to help you find the best candidate. And part of that has to be deciding on which is the best candidate.
well, not only that, but getting everybody else in a space where they can do that discovery. Everybody, if you don't do it all the time, you need a guide.
Yeah, I mean, it's not dissimilar to any expert that you hire to help you with something, I suppose, like whether it be a coach or I don't know, outsource sales, anything like that. You're paying for that expertise, so make the most of it, right? That makes perfect sense to me. The next question, really, and you've talked a little bit about it already, but I think the role of AI then in this process. I think two of the most time-consuming parts of the hiring process from that hiring manager, from the employer's point of view, is going to be the job description and then filtering the CVs at that first stage. That feels like the key area where something like an AI tool can save on that time, as you're talking about. Do you think it's ever going to go beyond that? Is it going to make these recruiters or the HR people obsolete? That's a dreaded word, I know, but...
Well, I think those are two different questions. Will technology go beyond where it is today? And I think the answer to that is inevitably. And the things that right now we don't think technology does very well, it's going to get better at. If we are thoughtful and ethical about our application of the technology. But there's a different part, at least in what I heard, and correct me if this is not your question, but the obsolescence or making recruiters kind of obsolete through technology. And I think that the best way to understand what's possible is to look back historically. Go back to 1967. And I was not around at that time, by the way, since I shamelessly revealed my age before. But Texas Instruments in 1967 released the first calculator. And there were more commercially successful models that came in the years that followed, but they were really the first one in 1967. And there was this big outcry about, math skills are going to diminish and bookkeepers would become, obsolete. People would lose their ability to do simple calculations. Fast forward to 1983, and Lotus 1-2-3 came out, which was a precursor to Microsoft Excel. And there was largely the same kind of fear and concern that this time accountants would become obsolete. But the opposite was true. The accountants and the bookkeepers became more valuable. And accountants, when you look back at it, shifted away from delivering value through calculations, and they shifted toward delivering value through analysis and strategy. And so the presence of tech didn't make those roles obsolete, but it did change the nature of those roles. And there was this evolution. When you look at the things that currently tech does really, really well, tech assimilates data, large amounts of data, and finds patterns. It does classification and standardization really well. It does matching tasks really well. But there are some things, at least in today, that it cannot do well. And I think this is farther down. Like, I don't think we're going to see a change or a shift quickly toward this aspect. But the things that human beings are still doing really well are all relational in nature. The work that recruiters and HR business partners do is largely about relationship building and complex decision making and conflict resolution and those kinds of things where, tech is not able to take those tasks on. So I don't think I'm actually very optimistic about what's going to happen with recruiters. I do think, and I think this because of what I've watched as other technological innovations have emerged. The people that embrace the technology are going to outpace the ones that don't. And so with regard to the tasks that technology can do better, if you are a recruiter or an HR business partner and you're still holding on to those, if you think your secret sauce is intake or writing the job description, it's not that tech is going to take that job or make you redundant. It's that other people who embrace the tech are going to do that. And I think that's a part of the evolution. And it's learning to let go of those things, recognizing now I've got this new pool of time that I can deal with. How do I want to apply those and finding, or how do I want to apply that time and finding higher value activities that only humans can do that you can be involved with. So I think that's what's going to happen. So I actually think technology is going to make recruiters and HR business partners more valuable. But again, mental model is everything. And again, I feel like that's like kind of my one note that I'm hitting, but it's so incredibly important, right? So if you envision that future and you are willing to make the migration, I think you're going to find yourself in an inherently more valuable, not less valuable place.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I feel like, because it's the same sort of thing I think about sometimes with leadership. Like, are we ever, as leaders, going to be replaced by the machine, in inverted commas? And I feel like it's very similar to the HR, to the recruiter. It's anything where the core part of your role is about those relationships and the people. I don't think, even if it like triples its capability every week, I can't see any AI or equivalent model being able to do that in the same way, if only because the people it's working with will always know it's not a person, and therefore they will not treat it as such, and the relationship bit won't work.
But that's today's point of view, and so like right, the migration, the evolution that we need to make today is going to be different than the evolution that we need to make tomorrow. And tech is going to continue to progress. And I think ultimately, and this is not genius like PhD level work on my part, but I think most computer scientists would agree, tech is going to be able to do some of those things in the future, but that will be a very different evolutionary point of view that we have in the future. And we can't see that yet because we haven't gotten to that point. What we can see now is tech is enabling with greater speed and greater accuracy certain things that we did as humans before. And that's letting us, go on and figure out new places to add value.
Yeah. I find it difficult not to go down the sort of the sci-fi dystopian future kind of point of view with some of this stuff where you sort of, I'm trying to think of a good example, but it's sort of the ones where the machine becomes your manager and it's just this soulless workplace, and you're basically just a drone with blood thrown through you. You're just punching in, punching out. Nobody cares. Nobody ever asks about your stress level.
I know you're saying that in jest.
Right? I am. I absolutely am.
I'm too optimistic to believe that, and I know you are too.
From certain point of view, so that's the way current workplaces work. So maybe it won't be getting worse. Maybe it'll be an improvement. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably more a sign that I watch too much sci-fi than it is anything else. But
what's your favorite sci-fi movie?
I can't choose. So the top two is the traditionals. It's Star Wars, Star Trek.
Okay.
I like Star Wars because it's more kiddie and it's fun, and you can check out with it and not think too hard. And I love Star Trek because it's that aspirational, inspirational future that we all want to live in one day.
I agree.
Yeah, and of course it's had impact on the real world as well, like sliding doors, mobile phones, all sorts. So yeah. Anyway. So one more question I'd love to get into on the AI side of it.
Mm.
One of the other big things, and you've mentioned it already, is trying to reduce bias. Now, hiring is a massive one, isn't it? Like all the time, the human's in the loop. Arguably, it's impossible to have a totally bias-free decision. What role can you see AI playing in that, and how do you think it would work?
Well, I mean, I think before you talk about reducing bias, no matter how you do it, you have to be thoughtful about how bias gets, introduced. And any recruiter that's in the audience right now, I hope will smile when, I give the example of a manager that's come in and said, just find me somebody like Priya. Just find me somebody like Naomi. Because that sort of nondescript, like, I don't really know what I want, but it's kind of over here. That sentence right there is where, bias starts. And it's not because somebody's intentionally trying to discriminate, because that's a more conscious bias. But the bias that gets introduced is one of, a failure to be concrete and objective. The more objective we can make something, you can't make everything totally objective, right? But the more objective you can make it, the less bias prone that system becomes. And so we talk about things like, confirmation bias. If I don't have a very good spec, if I don't have a very good definition of what I'm doing, and I mean, I apply this in the hiring context, but I think you can take the concept and you put it a bunch of places, right? If I'm not very specific and defined about what I'm looking for, then when I'm trying to compare or trying to make a selection or make an evaluation, confirmation bias, which is, the tendency to look for things that confirm a current point of view or opinions, creeps in. And something called undefined skills bias, which is a sort of tendency to default to overvaluing things that are easier to measure, like, as we were talking about before, years of experience. And so from the very beginning, when we're creating like the idea of like, what do we want to go and look for, the more objective that is, the more that bias can, be not eliminated, but certainly reduced. And so that's where I think tech has a real role to play, because tech can help to draw out those ideas and codify them and make them more concrete and specific. The next step in the selection process is candidate screening. And, if you look online today, I don't know how it is in UK. Here in the US, you have a job that's posted for a couple of hours and you've got 500 applicants in the thing. And a human recruiter is going to be subject, when you get pools of candidates that are that large, right? You're going to get things like decision fatigue bias, which is, getting mentally tired, which recruiters do from having to look at large, candidate pools. Makes you more prone to making superficial judgments, or pattern recognition bias, where we start, trying to apply shortcuts. When we feel overwhelmed, we're looking for ways to speed things up, and we start to use patterns to filter. And I think tech has a role to play there too. So, I think tech is going to be hugely influential in getting bias to be reduced. But it's not by getting the humans out of the equation. It's by changing where the humans come in and allowing tech to do some of the early stages. I think sets us up a whole lot more effectively for lower bias process.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, I have to say. I mean, there's horror stories about. I mean, it's more in the LLM kind of field, isn't there? About the accidentally built-in biases that have come out of the training data that wasn't perhaps considered in the same way. So again, like, there's something to be careful about there.
That's a really, really good point. With especially, so there's a difference between specially trained models and, commercially available. And, with commercially available large language models and generative AI, garbage in, garbage out. And, their training data is effectively the internet. And I don't think it's a strain of, credulity to say there's just a bunch of trash that's out there. So,
yeah, I mean, and that goes, of course, back to confirmation bias as well, which I have to say, it's not my favorite bias, but it's that one I think, like, it's my scapegoat bias. Do you know what I mean? So, like, all of the ills in society, I think we could trace that back to a confirmation bias somewhere. Maybe that is confirmation bias saying that. Oh, now I'm going to have to reassess. Anyway. But I do think, like, the whole critical thought piece, it's something that isn't taught early enough in schools, if at all. I'm sure that's true for the States as it is here.
Yeah.
And it's something that, in a world of social media and the algorithm deciding what we see, it's such an important and powerful skill to have, and most people just don't apply it. And that's
and I go back to mental model. Do you recognize the potential for it, and do you shape your own activities around that perception?
But the majority of people won't even think of that. Social media is just a source of news. Getting political, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, but when we say, like, people won't do it, you run this show to try and broaden people's awareness. And I think, the more people are engaged in activities like this, listening to conversations like this, thinking about subjects like this, I think the more probable it becomes that people will do that. And just kind of like we were talking about the need to evolve kind of what recruiters and HR professionals are doing with technology, I think technology is going to force all of us to evolve, including the way we consume, information. But it's not an overnight process.
Yeah, I think that's a better way of looking at it. Perhaps I was being unfair to the majority of people in the world, but certainly a lot of people.
I mean, I agree with you that the tendency is certainly there to do as you say.
Yeah, and I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just another symptom of this kind of all on, all the time, high speed world that we live in now, and just convenience when you don't. You've got 15 other things drawing on your attention. It's totally understandable. I'm not having a go or laying blame on anyone. It's just part of the world, isn't it? Yeah. What would you say then is the real cost of a bad hire in this day and age?
Well, it's the cost of a bad hire. We know, so HBR published an article not that long ago, I think 2022, 23, 80% of turnover can be attributed to hiring mistakes. And Career Builder ran a survey, and for the population that they surveyed, 74%, it was a survey of employers, 74% admitted to have hired the wrong person for an opening. That came from Career Builder. And we know that costs, at least in the US, the cost of that is about $600 billion annually. Globally, it's 1.1 trillion. But when we start to talk about the cost of a bad hire, like, the financial costs are more tangible and they're easier to gravitate toward. But there are a bunch of costs that don't usually, and I don't have very many interesting statistics on this, but they are ones that don't usually rise to people's attention. Like, you're going to put somebody in that job, and if you have not designed the role in the right way, and if you haven't gone through the selection process in the right way, and if ultimately you haven't hired the right person, and by the way, I think, David, I feel compelled to point out, a bad hire doesn't always necessarily immediately mean that the individual is a bad person or bad at their job or a bad worker. It means a lot of times that, and back to this concept of fit, they are just not the right fit for that organization, the right tool. And again, I don't mean fit in, right? And I'm not talking about, like, I don't like you in this role because you're not like me, right? But if you're not performing in the role, you may just be in the wrong role. And that is on the employer for having made that selection. So I think sometimes we get caught up in bad hire means bad employee. And I don't think that that's always the case. But if you put somebody in that isn't a fit, you are going to have low productivity on the job. And there is a cost to that. You're going to have an impact when you take the person out of that role. You're going to have an impact on the team because the other team members are now carrying, if that role was a necessary role, they're now carrying extra weight. That has an impact on them. The cost of the vacancy in terms of the team's productivity. You're going to have a cost, obviously, and it's the most tangible to replace that person. But you're also going to have an impact to the mental health and physical health of the individual you took out of the role that you originally put in and you took out, and on the team itself. And so that $600 billion accounts for financially kind of what the cost is. But I don't think it takes full account of all of the different factors that are going to cost either the person or the organization when you make an agreement that isn't a good match.
So it brings to mind this idea of, what's the cliche one? It's hire slow and fire fast, isn't it? I don't know how you feel about those two. For me, I think both should be fast to a point, but as ever, it's always about balance, isn't it?
Well, and again, like, I think if you know what you're doing going in, you don't have to hire slow. I agree with if it's not working out, don't belabor it. But I think an important thing to point out, though, is sometimes what the individual who is underperforming needs is to have an ally come to them. And I think oftentimes that is the direct, the person in a leadership role accountable for that individual to come to them and say, hey, like, let's talk about this. This isn't working. What can we do? How can I help? Do I need to show up differently? Let me tell you the things that aren't working. The same kind of honest conversation that we should be having in the interview process, we should also have when performance is not going the way that we want it to go. It should be an honest effort on both parties' side to make a change. But the way the leader comes to the table is going to color everything that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's in the leader's gift to do something about that, isn't it? Much more than anyone else in that scenario.
And I think it's fair to say it's their responsibility to do it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think, and I mean, to your point earlier about maybe, they're not, it's not pejorative, bad hire doesn't mean bad person or bad employer or anything like that. And I think most often actually it is exactly as you say, they're just in the wrong role for them. So, can you move them sideways? Is there something else in the organization that they would be a better fit? There's that word again for, or perhaps a role that fits them better rather than the other way around. Maybe that's a nicer way of saying it. But then again, I also think, and this is one area where I really struggle, because I feel like the individual and the specific context of the organization make a huge difference. And sometimes making that sideways move can be just as damaging, and I've seen this happen as well, where there's somebody who frankly was a toxic employee and they would just move sideways 2 or 3 times and everyone saw the toxic behavior being rewarded effectively. And so there's that side of it as well. You've got to, I don't know, context is king, isn't it? I guess.
but I think, but there's a difference. And just to be clear about the point I wanted to make, because I am certainly not an advocate of keeping people who are underperforming. I'm also not an advocate of shifting problems around. All I'm saying is that there's a big difference in result that happens when a leader comes to an individual with questions rather than assumptions. And what's going on here? And again, this is where I think if I'm accountable for outcomes, if the way that you as the leader have designed my role is outcomes based, and if there are objective measures of my performance that you've built into that design, then it's really easy. And I'll go back to just because it's the example I've been using. Like if my accountability is days outstanding and that number isn't moving, then a fair question from you is, what's going on? Why is the number not moving? Now, there are a variety of possibilities. One is I'm just not putting in the effort. I'm not doing the tasks. Okay, well, you got to do the tasks, right? There's just no way around that. But if I lead with an assumption of you're not interested in this, I miss oh my God, there's these other things that are happening in my personal life and I've just been distracted, right? And is that a temporary or a permanent situation? So I think as a leader, the mental model needs to be one of inquiry in the beginning, not one of hey, you're not performing here, so I'm going to shift you around, but what's going on with you? Let me just genuinely understand that. And you unlock a realm of possibilities with that. That was the point I wanted to make. No,
and I'm totally in agreement with that. I guess I was skipping a step or two ahead after that, because I agree. The first thing, you've got to understand what's going on, and exactly as you say, there might be, they might have lost a parent that week or something, or had an accident at home, who knows? Like, if you don't ask, and you've got to, I guess that's what I was sort of trying to get to about context is you need to understand the root cause, really. You know, what's the situation? What is it? A personal issue? Is it a fit issue? Is it, just genuinely a bad employee? Because that does still happen, unfortunately.
At the end of the day, the outcome is non-negotiable. It's established by the leader, right? But you want the person to feel engaged in the effort to try and achieve that outcome, and you can have both. And again, like your degree of specificity about whether you're asking for outcomes or asking for tasks, and then your mindset of inquiry, when it's not happening, matters a lot and creates differences in results.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I actually like the perfect world for me as a leader or as a manager is this is the outcome we need to deliver. Up to you how we get there, as long as you don't break the law.
Yeah.
Let me know how you're doing it because I'm curious. But aside from that,
but let's innovate.
Yeah. I think, that does require a very trusting working relationship, though, which sometimes has to be built over time. But that has to be the goal for leadership, in my view. I love asking everyone this question because some of the answers I get back are just really nice stories. So what has been your own personal best experience of being led?
So I had a sort of unusual relationship that was super formative in my career. I went to work for a call center company, and the role was in learning and development. And I met a guy there he was my boss. He was the VP of HR, and he was super, super formative in most of the later stages of my career. Oddly, the company had financial trouble, and we both got laid off on the same day, which was just the weirdest experience. And we wound up forming a company together. And I've always looked back at my experience with him, which was so different because we were in one context, I was a subordinate to him. And in another context, I was, we weren't of equal experience levels or life experience, but we were in that business, we were peers. And then we went to work for a different organization together, and I became a subordinate in a sort of a separate unit. And I look back at that and I think about his leadership, and the way I characterize it is he made it safe for me to have 9 bad ideas because he knew I was going to get to the one idea that would really change things. And it was never a pushover kind of thing. He never accepted my bad ideas, but I never felt unsafe having those bad ideas. And I wasn't by the way, just to clarify, I wasn't trying to have bad ideas, but it's a fact that in a creative endeavor, right? Like not everything that comes out is a good thing. And that safety and the way he created it for me made such an incredible difference because it kept me going. And so he would just, no, that's not it. That's a bad idea. But I knew it wasn't a fatal flaw. He was also a real master of that as a leader in being able to differentiate between, hey, I think you need to pay attention to this. And hey, this is a fatal flaw. This is, if you don't get this in check right now, this is going to derail you. And he was fairly thoughtful about expressing my shortcomings in those terms. And again, it was an effort, and I don't know whether he did it unconsciously or consciously. I choose to believe he did it consciously, but he was really trying to create that safety for me, knowing that, hey, I'm going to criticize you, but it's not over, right? I'm criticizing you because I want to help you. That was so meaningful to me, and probably that for me becomes the gold standard. But it also colors how, when I'm given the accountability to take the lead. That's how I try and lead is to create that same environment because I know how important it was for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's the textbook definition, isn't it, of constructive criticism? Yes, it's criticism, but that's not the end of the story.
Right. And it's the intent behind it. I think so often we focus on I think. I didn't hear this in what you said, but in my own experience, the constructive criticism thing sounds like I'm going to tell you something bad nicely. And that's less impactful than I'm going to tell you something that might be hard to hear, but with the intent that is genuine and pure and positive and for your own good. And if the intent comes across, the criticism, it sort of almost magically becomes less personal if that intent there. And that's when I coach managers, that's one of the things that I try and be deliberate about with the people that I coach, which is you got to declare that intent. People are not going to understand your intent. I think that's another important leadership lesson, is that the intent often gets hidden, and then bias comes in. Confirmation bias, among others, right? And so by declaring your intent, here's why I'm telling you this, you take some of that out, you make the negative interpretation harder, and you get back to the core of why you're offering the criticism to begin with, which is to improve and grow and hopefully function more effectively together.
Yeah, absolutely. That intent piece, I mean, not just for criticism, constructive or otherwise, is so important, because it's one of those things, isn't it? Like, if you don't state what it is, I mean, A, straight away that makes people suspicious. Like, why aren't you telling us what your intentions are? And B, they will then not necessarily attach to A, but usually these two go together. They'll fill in the blanks and assume the worst. Because, if it was a good thing, you would have told us, right? Like, so and I guess, the constructive criticism as well, that feels like one of those phrases that is so often misinterpreted, exactly as you said. Like, people take it as you're just dressing it up as criticism, right, and trying to make it appear nice, but you're still criticizing me. For me, right, I've always taken it quite literally. Like, it's criticism, but with an intent to build something.
And that's the key word.
Yeah.
Right?
So, and it's, I have to criticize you to this point, because otherwise I can't explain what it is that we need to improve together. But it is, that second part is the key here, not the criticism itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Intent means everything.
Absolutely.
Or means a lot.
Yeah, I think so. It's just one of those. I mean, it's so crucial to everything else in leadership as well, isn't it? Like trust and respect and teamwork, and we could go on and on and on. So rounding it up, then I have two more questions for you. The first one is, from everything we've covered so far, what would you say is the biggest leadership lesson that you've taken from your whole career so far?
Can I give you a poem?
That would be a first. Why not?
So when I was in high school, I went to a leadership conference, and I cannot tell you to this day, like I don't remember anything about it. But the speaker, who was the closing speaker at this conference, read this poem, and I went to him afterward and I said, "Can I have a copy of that? It was meaningful to me." And he said, "Yeah." And I gave him my address, and I thought, I'm never going to hear from this guy again. And about a week later, I get an envelope in the mail, and I open it up, and it's this tri-folded piece of paper, and it was printed by, again, I'm going to show my age. It was printed by a dot matrix printer. You can see the perforations on the edge, and it was all dot matrix out, but it was this poem by a man named R.L. Sharp. And the poem's called The Builder. And it goes, isn't it amazing how princes and kings and clowns who caper in sawdust rings and ordinary people like you and me are all builders of eternity. Each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mass, a book of rules, and each must make, ere life is flown, a stumbling block or a stepping stone. And I think in that there are three lessons that I take from that poem when I think about it. One is that leadership transcends titles and authority. The second is that you're the architect, and it's your actions that are going to shape the journey. And the last one is that intent matters. And if your intention as a leader is to leave stepping stones through tough terrain that is difficult for people to cross, then you're truly fulfilling the mission that I think every leader is given.
I love that. And it's so pertinent to everything we've talked about, and what we're both here to do as well, I think.
And it's hard work, but it's worthwhile work.
You have to send me a copy. No, you don't have to, because you've just said it, so I'll get it out of the transcript. It's all good.
So give me your address when we're done, and I'm going to the basement, and I'm going to cut the dot matrix printer, and I will do a copy, because that's all I have to do.
Yeah, I mean, knowing what they are and then actually owning one, those are two very different things as well, I would say. But
it wouldn't even plug into anything anymore.
yeah, you're probably right there. I bet there's somebody somewhere on eBay or something who's built an adapter for it. But
there's always somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And one more question. This is usually my favorite one. Every guest has to answer it, and it always has to be the last one. It's called Leadership Heroes.
Leadership Heroes.
So if you had to pick one person, it could be anyone you like, so alive or dead, past or present, real or even fictitious, if you like, but someone who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that be and why?
So in the States, back in the mid sort of 2010s, I think it was a little bit earlier than that, there were two candidates running for the presidency of the United States. And my example here is not intended in any way to be political. It's not about the parties, and especially not in the U.S., but it really is about the person. And Senator John McCain was running against Senator Obama, who would ultimately be president. And Senator McCain was hosting a town hall. And there was a narrative going on at the time that President Obama had not been born in the United States, and as a result, according to our Constitution, couldn't hold the office. And at this town hall, a woman stood up, and she had taken the microphone from Senator McCain, and she was spouting off these things that we know not to be true. And he put his hand really gently on her shoulder, and he took the mic from her, and he looked at her, and he said, "No." And she looked back at him and she said no. And you can watch this on the video. I'm sure you can find the video online of this. But she looks back at him and she says no. And he says no. And she sits down. And when I watch that, I think that's leadership. And that's an aspect of leadership that I think a lot of leaders have forgotten. One is, it's a dangerous business to lead. But back to the stepping stone metaphor, right? You are either going to make a huge difference, correct that. You are going to make a huge difference as a leader in somebody's life. It's either going to be positive or negative. It's either a stumbling block or a stepping stone. And in this case, Senator McCain had the opportunity to whip the crowd up into a frenzy and to rally support behind what effectively was an untruth. But he chose the exact opposite. And he didn't say these words, but you can see it in his actions. He said, I'm not going to win like that. I'm going to do the hard thing. I think the other aspect of that and why he's a hero is that, leadership, I think we sometimes have come to believe that, leadership is about going where the crowd is. And it's really not. It's just the opposite. It's standing apart from that crowd. There's a really great book called Leadership on the Line by a Harvard professor named Ron Heifetz and his writing partner in that effort, Marty Linsky. And, they say, leadership is a verb, not a noun. You can only see it when it's being exercised. And the act of leadership is about frustrating an organization at a rate that it can absorb in the cause of making change. And that's what he was doing, is he was saying, I'm not going to win that way. Like, I'm not coming over to the crowd. I'm going to lead the crowd over to what the right answer is. And that's creating, stepping stones. That's not creating stumbling blocks. That's why leadership is so hard. But that's why he, in that moment, and I don't agree with him politically, but he was a hero to me in that moment, because that is the full embodiment of what I think leadership should be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great choice. I don't think we've had him before either. So bonus points. Yeah, I mean, he's one of those, every now and then, there's usually like a few per generation, isn't there? There's a politician who does literally stand head and shoulders above the rest in terms of their obvious like morality. And I think, I don't want to get political either, but I feel like those individuals are becoming fewer and far between in modern politics. And I think even from the outside the US, we were aware of him, and he was one of those. He was like that maybe potentially, again, trying to avoid being too political, but the last conservative that you could sort of see that different mindset. I'm trying to walk the line really carefully here. I hope you know what I mean. Where he would put like the general right or wrong, the common good first, even if it meant he would lose. And I think, in politics as a whole, that is becoming more and more rare these days, isn't it?
But I think your point is right. But I would also suggest that that it's just a microcosm of the world we live in, and I think it's equally hard to apply that kind of lesson inside of an organization as it is if you're a political leader, right? You have to have that belief that like I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing it with the right intent, and I'm not afraid to do it alone. I'm not afraid to try and frustrate the system at a rate that it can absorb.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, of course, you're right. I think politics is one of those things, isn't it? Like it's such great and fertile ground, isn't it, for people like us who talk about leadership, because it's one of those examples everyone will know who you're talking about and everyone can relate to it.
It's visible.
Exactly. It's visible, yeah. But you're right, of course. I mean, to some extent, it's a reciprocal relationship, isn't it, between the rest of society and, arguably our politics is a reflection of our civilization. So, take that or leave it, I guess. But I do think though, despite what I just said, like that moral, ethical dimension for me is core to what makes modern forward-looking leadership different to the kind of leadership that we've experienced in the past centuries, past decades even. And that is such a great example of it in practice as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, Scott, we're I'm just going to say we're out of time. We're over time. Thank you for sticking with me. If any of the listeners or the viewers, if they're watching us on YouTube and Spotify now, would like to learn more about you, I'm sure loads of them would, or maybe get in touch, find out how to work with you, how to use Athena, where can they go to find out more?
So you can learn about the company. The company's name is PropulsionAI. You'll find us on the web at getpropulsion.ai. Getpropulsion.ai. And if you want, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I welcome the connections. And if you want to take any of the topics, deeper, or if I can be of help, I'm happy to help.
Lovely. And I'll pop those links in the show notes so everyone can find it easily as well. Well, Scott, it's been great talking with you today. Thank you again so much and have a great rest of your day.
David, thank you so much for the invitation. I can't believe where the time went. You're just an easy guy to talk to. Congrats on the show. Thank you so much for having me on. Take care.
Well, thank you again, Scott, for your time today. Really enjoyed that conversation and some great insights there into the world of HR and hiring processes. I think you've probably persuaded me to your point of view as well. I've been a bit of a skeptic around technology and removing the human element in these processes, but actually, the way you talked about it today, I think I'm with you now. Listener, if you would like to learn more about Scott and his company and what they do check those links in the show notes and click on them. Go and see the website, reach out to him on socials, learn more things. If anything we've talked about today in the leadership sphere rang any bells with you, if it's something you're struggling with and you just like to have a conversation about leadership, do reach out to me as well. Again, you'll find my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Click on that, reach out, connect, drop me a message, whatever's good for you. Alternatively, if you'd like to be part of the Integrity Leaders community, do visit the website. Again, the link is in the show notes, but it's www.leadingwithintegrity.co.uk. Hit that green button, take you through the sign-up process to become part of our community. You benefit from all sorts of leadership resources, including access to one-to-one time with me. Also, feel free, if you want to browse the new website before you click that button, there's plenty of new information on there. Hopefully some of it will hit one or more of the issues that you're struggling with, and you might get some useful information from there before you join as well. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of that before you join or click on any of the buttons. Thank you so much for being with us today, for listening or viewing if you're with us on YouTube or Spotify. Really appreciate you being here, appreciate your time and your attention. And the podcast wouldn't keep going if nobody was listening to it, I'll be honest. So thank you. You're keeping Leading with Integrity alive. Join me again next week when I'll be chatting culture, well-being, leadership, burnout, the dynamics of the workplace, and more with my next guest, Kelsey Neff. And until then, stay safe and be a leader, not a boss.